pray for you folks in Troy, Missouri. It's been a joy to be here. It's so good to have Ken and Esther Jones back with us tonight, my dear friends who for so long grew up living there in New Hampshire, and good to see Esther feeling better back with the kiddos tonight. So good to have you guys as well. So we're going to finish things up in our creation investigation and wrap it up by talking a little bit about the Genesis flood. But here's some scientific stuff that you might not have heard before. Did you hear about the new restaurant called Karma? There's no menu, you just get what you deserve. Might not be so good. What's the difference between a cat and a comma? A cat has claws at the end of its paws. A comma has a paws at the end of its claws. What did the bald man exclaim when he received a comb for a present? Thanks, I'll never part with it. Some of these hit close to home, right, Ken? Some of us, we don't have much partying left to do. What did the left eye say to the right eye? Between you and me, something smells. What did one hat say to the other? You wait here, I'll go on ahead. Why couldn't the leopard play hide and seek? Because he's always spotted. Okay, some of these are bad, you know. Did you hear about the two people who stole a calendar? They each got 6 months. Why are skeletons so calm? Because nothing gets under their skin. What kind of exercise do lazy people do? Diddly squats. Okay, scientific stuff, all this. Faith, flood, and fossils. Faith, flood, and fossils is our topic for this afternoon's session. Here's our outline. We're going to talk about a more reasonable faith. See, this assumes both the creation model and the evolution model are positions of faith. Neither one can be hard science because we can't test them by the scientific method. We can't observe, we can't repeat something like the Big Bang or life coming from non-life. You can theorize it happened in the past, but it's not hard science. It's a position of philosophy, speculation, faith. We'll talk about the analysis of the Genesis flood record from the Bible. We'll kind of march through the biblical timeline there, and we'll give some scientific evidence for geological catastrophe. That's where we're going tonight. Now, Bertrand Russell was an atheist, and he defined faith this way. See if you like this. We may define faith as a firm belief in something for which there is no evidence. We may define faith as a firm belief in something for which there is no evidence. What do you think of that definition of faith? Incorrect. You don't like that. Why don't you like Bertrand Russell's definition of faith? There is evidence, right? We've been talking about it for the last 3 days. There's lots of evidence. And we'll talk about some more. I think that's a good definition for insanity myself. See, there's things that we hold to be true because there's evidence that we will never be able to scientifically confirm. That doesn't mean they're not true. It just means you can't go into a laboratory and actually test it and prove it out the way you could the laws of physics or the laws of chemistry, say. But it doesn't mean there's no evidence for it. I can't take you back in time to say, okay, here is, Ford's Theater, there's Abraham Lincoln, and here's this guy Booth comes in and shoots him and all this. But the evidence is pretty strong that he was the guy, right? So we have this historical record of Abraham Lincoln's assassination, and we think it was this guy, and we're pretty sure of that. It's good evidence. But you can't scientifically prove it. It's a historical event that happened that we can't confirm. So I'm going to go with a better definition of faith, and that's given to us in the book of Hebrews. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1 says, now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Let's talk about that for just a minute here. Substance is a very concrete term. We use it in science. We can take a pure element like hydrogen, and another pure element like oxygen, and we combine them together, 2 hydrogens for 1 oxygen, and we get a substance that we call water. It's not a pure element, it's a combination of different elements, and we call it a substance. We can take carbon and oxygen, form them together, we call it carbon dioxide, hopefully not carbon monoxide, right? CO2. It's a very concrete word. It's a scientific word. And then we have this odd juxtaposition where we have the substance of things hoped for. Well, that seems like a kind of an odd combination, doesn't it? Now, understand the biblical word hope doesn't mean like, oh, I hope to win the lottery someday. It is a firm expectation. But still, it's things that you can't touch. Like, I have this hope in Jesus Christ to be in heaven with God for all eternity. That's my hope. But I can't touch that. It's spiritual. And I think what the author of the Hebrews is saying is our faith takes things that we hope for and makes it so real that we can almost touch it. That's what biblical faith is like. It's not a leap in the dark. It's not like, oh, well, pick a religion, hopefully get the right one, and everything will turn out okay. That's not the nature of biblical faith. And then the author of the Hebrews says, faith is the evidence of things not seen. Now, we use the word evidence in the scientific arena, but there's another occupation that uses it even more. What's that? Crime, law, right? You have a court case, and you're going to present your evidence. Now, let's say that we have a court case, okay? And the court case is going down here, and my friend Ken here, he's being accused of, committing a crime. He was mad at the neighbor, and he threw a brick through the neighbor's glass, or something like this. And he's on trial, and his lawyer's there, and he's in front of the jury and stuff. And I get up, and I'm a star witness, and I say, well, Your Honor, I didn't see anything, I didn't hear anything, but as far as I'm concerned, he looks guilty. Now, if his attorney's worth anything, what's he going to say? Objection, we don't want to hear the witness's opinion of my client. We want to hear the evidence. And the lawyer is going to say, yes, objection sustained, get rid of this witness. This guy doesn't know anything. We want to hear about the footprints, or what did you see, what did you hear, we want to hear about the crime scene or something, but not your opinion. And yet here we have this interesting combination of words, the evidence of things not seen. And I think what the author of Hebrews is saying is our faith takes things we haven't seen like God and creation and stuff, and it makes it so real, you could take it in a court of law and you can bank your life on it. That's the nature of biblical faith. It's very firm. Maybe not scientifically provable, but it's not kind of a leap in the dark. God never asks you to check your brain at the door. In contrast to that, Isaiah 1:18, come now and let us reason together, says the Lord. Though your sins be as scarlet, they shall be white as snow, they shall be red like crimson, they shall be as wool. We read about the Apostle Paul going into the synagogue and proving, a very strong Greek word, proving that this is very Christ. So God wants us to use our brains. God wants us to engage this machine that He's given us. That doesn't mean that we can prove everything scientifically and turn into rationalists. But what it does mean is God allows us to have wonderful evidences. And Hebrews chapter 11 goes on to say in verse 3, through faith we understand the worlds were framed by the word of God. So the things which were seen were not made of things which do appear. God made this world ex nihilo, that's out of nothing, not evolved it from something. That's a position of faith. I can't prove that scientifically. We need to have faith to believe in creation. Well, hopefully this slide's getting kind of familiar to you by now, right? Our three models. I'm not going to belabor it, but we're going to visit about this last one today, and that is the big geological formations of this world. Canyons, the rock layers. Were they formed slowly over millions of years, or were they formed quickly via catastrophe? That's what we want to talk about in this session. Hebrews 11:7 says this, by faith Noah. Fairly quickly, the author gets to this great man of faith, Noah. By faith Noah, being warned of God as things not seen as yet, moved with fear, prepared an ark to the saving of his house. The Bible spends a fair amount of time on this guy in the early chapters of Genesis, this guy Noah, and for good reason. And yet, The flood record has become the focal point of modern geologists' attack. Why do today's geologists have such a hatred, really, kind of a visceral reaction to the Genesis flood? Why do you think that's the case? Josiah?
It stands opposed to their theories.
Okay, it stands opposed to their theories, exactly. In what way is it such a problem for the theories? Yeah.
When they said that all this took place, the erosion took place over millions of years, and it probably took place in a very short time.
Right. See, here's the problem. If you all of a sudden explain all these layers in a short period of time, you just wipe out all the slow and gradual one thing evolving into another. They want you to believe that, there was these invertebrates, right? These creatures without a backbone, kind of like this little snail that's here. And for many millions of years, there was this. And then eventually, we got some backbone guys like Nemo. Nemo's got an important part of the story, too, here in the whole evolutionary of things. And then eventually, some of these fishies, they kind of traded in their fins for some really basic limbs, and they crawled up on the land, and they became amphibians. And so you have the Cambrian, and you have the Devonian, the great period of fishes, then the Permian, the age of these amphibians, and then you have the Mesozoic, the great age of dinosaurs and reptiles, and finally you get to the Cenozoic, the age of the mammals and the birds. And so you have these different layers, see? And as soon as you say, well, that all happened in a year, you just got rid of billions of years of evolution, poof, they're gone. So that's a problem. And that's why Lyell, remember him, fought so hard against the idea of the flood. Let's get Moses out of the sciences, which was code for get rid of the Genesis flood. Okay, but what they don't tell you is that we have this universal flood belief in the traditions and languages of almost every single major nationality. 270 people groups have a flood tradition. Let me just give you some examples. Here we have the Hawaiians. This is before the missionaries came, okay? They had these legends. Long before the death of Kunahana, the first man, the world became a wicked and terrible place to live. There's one good man left. His name was Nu'u. Isn't that interesting? Nu'u. Where'd they get that from? He made a great canoe with a house on it and filled it with animals. The waters came up over all the earth and killed all the people. Only Nu'u and his family were saved. Well, this is the Toltec Indians of ancient Mexico. They say the first world lasted for 1,716 years. You add up the genealogies, that's almost exactly what you get in the Bible. And it says it was then destroyed by a flood that covered the highest mountains by 15 cubits. So they're right on with the Bible there. Only one family named Cox. Well, they got the name a little bit, spun around on that one. Can't explain Cox. But you see these similarities to the biblical account. The most famous flood story outside the Bible is the Epic of Gilgamesh. This exists on these cuneiform tablets in Babylonia, and it is amazing how close this is to the Bible story. He's got this Gilgamesh who took his family of 8. He has a big boat, 2 of each kind of creature. They saved the world's creatures during the Great Flood. In fact, the story is so close to the Bible story that the skeptics said, well, the Jews copied the Babylonians. While they were in Babylon, it wasn't written by Moses, While they were in Babylon, they took this Epic of Gilgamesh and they pulled it into their Genesis account. And that's how they got the story of the Great Flood. Well, in recent years, a new tablet has been discovered in the area of Babylon. This one isn't as well known. It's called the Nippur tablet. And the Nippur tablet is hundreds of years older than the original Gilgamesh tablet. And this tablet doesn't differ from the Bible in any detail. Now, which is the original? Well, it's the account that's the same as the Bible. In archaeology, the gold standard is to get older, and the more you go down into recent stories, things get expanded just a little bit, It's kind of like my uncle's fish stories. Every time he tells a story, the fish gets just a little bit bigger, right? So, 2011, the Nippur tablet. Well, the oldest intact civilization is the Chinese. Chinese civilization goes almost right back to the Tower of Babel. And we talked about that a little bit with that tree, that bronze tree this morning. But here you have some texts that are crazy old. Really, really old books. The Huanazi tells about the time when the poles that supported the roof of the world were broken, the continents broke up, and there was a flood. This other one, Shu Jing, this is 1000 BC, a 3,000-year-old book, talks about the floods that rose over the hills, covered the mountains, and drowned all living things. In the midst of this calamity, a hero named Nuwa. How about that? Nuwa comes along to help replenish the earth. So the Chinese have this story about this great hero, Nuwa. Very, very interesting. This is a story that's a 3,000-year-old story. But here's the interesting thing about the Chinese. The Chinese don't write with letters. You understand that, right? They draw pictures. And they have a picture for a word. And to get a more complicated word, they combine maybe some pictures together to get like a compound word, a really complicated word. And there are some even older stories than this 1000 BC, but they're fragments. They're just bits and pieces. So we can't even read the whole story. But by looking at the pictures, we can glean some knowledge from ancient China. So we have from 2500 BC, crazy old, the bronzeware and the oracle bone. And here is the ancient pictograph for to build. It's a combination of a boat and a roof and an announcement. What are they talking about? To build is a boat, a roof, and an announcement. I wonder. Here is their old word for ship, a large boat. It's a combination of boat, their number 8, and a mouth. A mouth is a person. So 8 people on a boat is a huge ship. Now you might not think 8 people is a particularly large ship, but there's knowledge there of this huge ship that they carried with them coming out of Babel. Here is the old Chinese word for violent. Violent. It's a combination of water, 2 hands, ejecting outwards, going up all the way to the sun. Is this sounding familiar? Flood knowledge in these ancient Chinese scripts. Here's one more. This is their word for formerly, like in the old days. And there's a slight deviation between the oracle and the bone. One has water going up to the sun, the other is covering everything but the sun. But the same idea. That's what happened in the old days. There's this massive water that covered everything but the sun. Now, as soon as you start talking seriously about the flood in scientific circles, they start asking questions. And this is the number one question I get asked. Well, come on, Dino Dave. You tell me you really believe that story? Yeah. Well, then how did Noah fit all the animals in the ark? Don't you know there's all these thousands, millions of species? How are you going to get all those in the ark? Okay, so let's answer this question. Number one, God brought them to him. Noah didn't have to sneak around. Boom! Okay, Shem, home aboard. We tranquilized him. No, I mean, God brings the animals to him. Number two, you don't have to bring every variety and species. You just got to bring one of the kind. All these guys up here, the lion, the jaguar, the leopard, the house cats, the naked. Can you believe there's such a thing as a naked cat? That's a real thing. I don't know if I'd want one as a pet, kind of ugly looking, but that's all one kind, it's all cats. And down below, you get the dogs and the coyotes and the foxes and the Great Danes and the wolves and all that. That's all one dog kind. You just need 2 dogs. That's all. You don't need all the varieties. You got the genetic capacity afterwards for all these different varieties to develop. Does that make sense? Okay. This idea of a kind is really important in the Bible. God kind of drills this home in Genesis chapter 1. And God made the beasts of the earth after his kind, the cattle after their kind, everything that creeps on the earth after his kind. The earth brought forth the grass, and herb yielding seed after his kind. The tree yielding fruit whose seed was in itself after his kind. Lots of variety in the kinds, but one kind does not morph into another kind. That's kind of fundamental to the creation model. So number one, God brings it. Number two, many did not need to come. Did you have to have goldfish bowls in the ark? He says, no, why not? They're fish. They're swimming around through the whole flood. They're going places, they're going on vacation, they're checking spots out they've never been before, right? They don't have to be on the ark. All the swimming creatures aren't on the ark. And then many could be taken as babies. Look, you get a choice between bringing the grandpa dinosaur or bringing a baby dinosaur. Which one are you going to do? You take the baby, right? Easier to handle, takes up less space, eats less food, and has more years of life to have offspring after the flood. So you bring the little ones on. And then, number 4, provisions could be stored for those who do not hibernate. A lot of creatures can go into hibernation. Bears do, and others. Some creatures go into hibernation if climatic conditions get bad enough, even if they don't hibernate as a rule. And then lastly, Noah's Ark was huge. How many of you guys been to the Ark Encounter up there in Kentucky? How many have been there? Brother, you need to organize a trip, for sure, and get the church up. That is phenomenal. Guys, it's well worth it. It's worth going there to see that thing. You guys should go up as a group or something. I've been there twice. It is really sharp. It's really well done. But this boat, I mean, it is the size of a football field. Huge. And you see it in person, it has a wow effect. Those of you guys that have been there, you following me? I mean, you hear what I'm saying? It's like, wow. The thing is just massive. There's lots of room for the animals, lots of room for the food. There was lots of room for more people if they wanted to come. Obviously they didn't want to believe. An analysis was done by Henry Morris for his classic book, and Jonathan Whitcomb for their classic book of the Genesis flood. There are 2.5 macroscopic living creatures on earth. 60% are aquatic. Of the 40% that are left, you got 70% are insects. They could have gone in on the hide of an elephant or a hippo, right? There's only a few thousand kinds, mostly smaller than a dog. The capacity of the ark was equivalent to 522 railroad cars. That's how big the ark is in capacity. 73 such stock cars could have carried all these animal kinds. So there's lots of room, plenty of room on the ark. Okay, and of course you had 7 of the clean kinds, and so, but there's plenty of room, plenty of room. Okay, that's more reasonable faith. Now let's open our Bibles to Genesis. If you've got your Bibles and you want to follow along in God's Word, we're going to begin by going to Genesis, and we're going to march through our timeline in 3 steps. We're going to talk about the onslaught of the flood, we're going to talk about the prevailing of the flood, and we're going to talk about the abatement of the flood. Those are our 3, as the Bible breaks it down, the 3 steps here in the way the flood record lays out. So Genesis chapter 7, and we're going to begin in verse 11. Genesis chapter 7 and verse 11. In the 600th year of Noah's life, the 2nd month, the 17th day of the month, the same day were the fountains of the great deep broken up and the windows of heaven were opened. What's the 2 sources of the flood water? Fountains and these windows of heaven. Okay, now what are these 2 things? Well, it was something we talked about in our last session. Again, it's just an interpretation, but perhaps it could be that water vapor canopy collapsed at this point. Maybe you had a comet, asteroid, something that came in and just even maybe a swarm of asteroids hit the earth, wham, and that collapses this water vapor canopy, and you have this torrential rain for 40 days and 40 nights. We do see some tremendous meteor impacts at one point on the earth, like have never been recorded in regular history. Massive craters, and also on the moon, on one side of the moon. So it was a particular time that came in, while up the moon on that side, smashed through the earth, and we've kind of passed through maybe a zone of a meteor shower or something like that. Also, we know that the earth has this wobble. If you get a top and you wind it up real good and get it spinning, and then you bump it, it'll keep spinning, but it might have a slow wobble, even as it's spinning. You've seen this, right? It's called a precession. And the earth goes through a precession where its axis kind of tilts a little bit, like as if it's been struck at one point. So maybe, could possibly be, that was when the flood started. And we see something interesting. After the flood, the ages people are living drops right off. Could that be that water vapor canopy is now gone? See? And so these guys are living 900 years, and then boom, very quickly it drops down to a couple, 300 years, And then by the time of Abraham, it's down to 175. Here, kind of the middle, Isaac, Jacob, and it goes down to the point where it hits about 100 and then settles in around 70 or so. Now, if you were to take a big straw and go and suck all the water off planet Earth and look at the ocean, it'd look a little bit like this. You have this rift, this crack, this tear in the crust of the Earth that goes right down the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. What is that? You remember this morning I said that very likely there was originally one continent on the whole of the original Earth, Pangaea. And you can see how Africa and South America kind of fit together, right? So if the meteor impacts something like that right there and breaks this continent apart, and the fountains of water, God has stored up some water underground. See, because this is important in the whole model. Remember, no rain. Well, if you don't have rain, how do you have a river coming out of Eden? Probably there's water that's stored up under pressure and it's coming bubbling, artesian systems coming bubbling up like Old Faithful kind of thing. Geysers pushing up, causing these rivers to come out of the Garden of Eden. Well, now all of a sudden you impact that with a meteorite and all that water that's under pressure comes up in one big the fountains of the great deep, with enough pressure that starts to move the continents apart. And of course, they're all on these plates. And so they start sliding. And these plates start moving apart. And that rift zone there is where those fountains came tearing out and came shooting up, maybe a long ways up into the atmosphere, adding most of the flood water, going miles down and shooting way up into the atmosphere. And that would have provided the flood water that comes down. Look at this little animation of this. But you see that crack kind of happening as literally the fabric of the earth gets ripped apart. These fountains come shooting out, and wow, what a scary time to be on planet Earth and not be in the ark, right? These subterranean chambers bursting open. So you get some interesting stuff that's happening scientifically. The continental plates are being broken apart. They're starting to move. You have these, would have carried a lot of dirt and rocks up there with it. And of course, it's not just raining down. Now it's falling down rocks and debris, dirty rain. Extensive volcanic activity, you're breaking open seams of magmas, and you've got earthquakes and tsunamis that are starting to happen. And the first thing to get buried in a tsunami, carrying a lot of debris, moving through the oceans, is going to be what? Sea creatures. What do you mean by sea creatures, Dino Dave? Lots and lots of clams. Here's some clams I dug out myself down in the Paluxy River down in Glen Rose, Texas. And you can come look at these. They're not anything too fantastic, but I got a couple of cool ones here too that are a little bit fancier. This one here is beautifully fossilized. Look at that, huh? And then this one here. Come take a look at these afterwards. But you've got these marvelous clam fossils. Now, very interesting. They're always fossilized, closed. What's that telling you? They got buried alive. If this is slow and gradual over hundreds and hundreds and millions of years, and clams just die and they kind of fall down the bottom, are they going to be closed? What happens to a clam when it dies? Some of you guys that eat clams and boil clams up, what happens to them? It's a big muscle, and when the muscle relaxes, it opens up. These guys died by fossilization. That's how fast it was. And so when we look at the fossil record, 95% of all of our fossils in our collections are marine invertebrates or shellfish. 95% of what's left are plant and algae. Only 1/100th of our fossils are vertebrates, and those are mostly fish. The fossil record is best understood as a marine cataclysm. That's the big picture of the fossil record. Lots of marine creatures, lots of clams, oysters, shellfish. That's the majority of the fossil record, a great majority. And as I say, they're fossilized clothes, and you find these on the tops of the mountains, on the top of Mount Everest, in the Himalayas. You got on tops of all the mountains of the world, we have fossilized clams. It's all once underwater. Well, moving forward in our biblical record here, if you got your Bibles, let's go at Genesis chapter 7, verse 19. And Genesis 7:19 says, the waters prevailed exceedingly upon the earth, and the high hills that were under the whole of heaven were covered. Now the water's coming up onto the continents. Not just kind of tsunamis moving the oceans, but kind of coming up on the continents, and it's covering the hills. Perhaps at this time, you got the ark starting to kind of move in the water, maybe even going out towards sea, and people are saying, oops, we are on the wrong side of that boat. Well, there's still some mountain peaks that are visible, so people are climbing up into the high hills and the mountains. Some of the animals that are a little bit more astute are climbing with them and coming up into the high areas. But these massive waves are coming ashore, tsunamis coming and going, sweeping creatures out with them and then coming back in again and then going back out again. And so you've got a little bit of coming and going as the water's going higher and higher and higher each time. And scientifically, a lot of interesting things happening here. You have tremendous amounts of erosion happening. You have the low-lying areas that are swampy getting covered with debris. The tsunami's bringing in debris and then also hauling some out with it as it goes back out. And so we have these systems. They're called mega sequences in the fossil record. And they come in and they go out with debris. And so first the marine creatures. Now the swamps are getting covered. Well, what's living in the swamps? What are some swamp creatures? Crocodiles. Crocodilians are in the swamps. What else? Dinosaurs. My buddies. And these guys are mostly kind of dumb. They're and they just get buried. You know, they're not real smart about let's migrate to the high country. They're just kind of, small-brained reptiles here. And then we have these debris pools. That is, in every flood, you have the water moving really fast till it gets to an area where it kind of slows down. Where it slows down, you see it kind of like circulating, and that's where you're going to find the flotsam and the jetsam and the foam. And if you're a good fisherman, you also know that's the place to put your worm in because the fish aren't dumb. The fish know the goodies are coming down and they're waiting for stuff there. They're in ambush. And so these debris pools where all the stuff that's getting carried down kind of ends washed out in one big area. And in Genesis 7:20, we read 15 cubits upward did the waters prevail and the mountains were covered. So now the whole thing's getting covered. And why 15 cubits up? Why does God let the water go up much more than's even needed for the mountains? My friends, there's no accident in any of this. We read that the ark had a draft of, it was 30 cubits high, so had a draft of roughly 15 cubits if it's sitting halfway down in the water. So God wanted to make sure there's enough water where it's not going to scrape any mountains as it floats around, the whole world. And so it's 15 cubits over the mountains to cover the draft of the ark. So now masses of vegetation that were carried down are getting buried by dirt, and the rising flood waters are covering the higher grounds, and some of those creatures that had gone higher, people and maybe tigers and some of these mammals that are a little smarter, now they're getting carried down and they're getting buried. So you got the marines, then you get the swamp creatures, now we're getting the mammals. And so little by little, everything is getting buried. Now, we have a feature of the fossil record that's kind of cool called fossil graveyards. This is kind of really important if you're a paleontologist. The fossils are not kind of scattered. There's nothing, and then boom, they're all in a big area called a fossil graveyard. And one of them is the Gobi Desert. 25 dinosaurs have been discovered along with 200 skulls of mammals. The Gobi Desert is a paradise for paleontologists. Freshly exposed skeletons look more like recent remains of a carcass than an 80-million-year-old fossil. Well, it's maybe because it's not 80 million years old, right? But no, this Gobi Desert, you get all these kind of saber-toothed tigers and crocodiles and dinosaurs all just jumbled together. Here in South Carolina, there were the phosphate beds. So many creatures got jumbled together and the bones ground up that they used it for fertilizer. And it took them years to mine it out. But there was remains of people and hadrosaurs and deer and plesiosaurs and dogs and iguana and sheep. And all this stuff jumbled together. Evidence of a flood. There's a fossil graveyard. Look at all that stuff. Here's another one. They show these in major museums. You go to the Harvard Museum, the Carnegie Museum, the American Museum of Natural History. They've got examples of fossil graveyards. This is a huge feature of the fossil record. Now, the Bible says the waters prevailed. We're entering that second phase. Now the waters aren't going up, but they're not yet going down. And they prevail for 150 days, 6 months, a half a year. It's just sitting there. And Noah's beginning to say, Lord, are we going to get rid of this flood too? I mean, how many times can you play tiddlywinks with Shem, Ham, and Japheth, right? If the water's just going up, it's going down, it's going up, it's going down, the waves, and, well, there's some important stuff happening down underneath. All this pressure of all this water pushing down on all these freshly buried organisms are turning them into fossils. Quickly. Coal and oil is being created. And the regular tidal flows of the moon going around, kind of lifting up sediments and settling it down, lifting up. We see these layers, very thin layers, lots of them in certain areas of the earth where we have these laminae, these thin layers. Now you might be saying, really, you're going to form fossil fuels in a year? Dino Dave, how are you going to do that? Are you going to fossilize all this stuff that fast? Here is a 2014 article from Science News. Quote, the fossilization process was probably taking just a few hours, no more than a few days. Why does Dave Martill, who's not a creationist, say this? Because we have all this fine tissue being preserved, eyeballs, skin, scales. If this isn't happening quick, guess what's going to happen to that soft tissue? Huh? It's going to decompose or get scavenged, right? No way. This is not a slow and gradual. My friends, this has to be fast, catastrophic. It's the only possible explanation for it. It doesn't take millions of years to make a fossil. It just does not. In fact, if it sits there too long, it's going to get scavenged or decomposed. It has to get buried quickly, and then has to have a certain amount of pressure, and it will very quickly turn into a fossil. Well, what about fossil fuels? Doesn't that take millions of years, Dino Dave? Let's talk about coal for a minute. We have this 20,000 square mile coal reserve in the Powder River Basin of Montana and Wyoming. The coal is 200 feet thick, 240 billion tons of coal. Can you show me anywhere on the face of the earth where anything like that is happening today? That if you just give it enough time, you're going to eventually get 240 billion tons of pure bituminous coal? No. Nothing's like that's happening. Even if it was happening slow and gradual, you'd have, tornadoes and dust storms blowing dirt and dust and leaves and all kind of skeletons of creatures and stuff. You wouldn't get pure coal. Understand this is pure black coal, 200 feet thick. That goes for 20,000 miles, square miles. That requires a catastrophe, the likes of which we have never seen, to bury all that vegetation and then compress it into coal. Well, what about oil? Doesn't that take millions of years to form? So scientists at the U.S. Department of Energy, Pacific Northwest National Labs, were able to transform harvested marine algae into crude oil in less than 1 hour. What does it require? A lot of heat, a lot of pressure. Does not take millions of years. It can happen very quickly. Let me tell you a story about nautiloids. What's a nautiloid? Nautiloid is this kind of bashful-looking dude in a party hat. Here's a nautiloid fossil. Some of your kids can come check this out afterwards. They supposedly add a ring every year. You can count up and see how old this nautiloid is. But a nautiloid's a creature that we believe is extinct, and he's kind of a squid-like dude, and he lives in the party hat. And if you went to the Grand Canyon some years ago, they would have told you these nautiloids are very rare. But you can occasionally find one if you look for it. And then a guy by the name of Steve Austin began studying the limestone. He was challenged, really, by the evolutionists. The evolutionist said, that limestone had to happen gradually. It couldn't happen fast in a flood. Your whole idea for the Grand Canyon is a problem because the limestone had to happen quickly, or had to happen slowly to form limestone. So he began studying the limestone, and you see this nautiloid. You see it there? That's one laying nice sideways. You can kind of see it there. Well, Steve Austin began studying the Redwall limestone in the Grand Canyon. And here's what he found. Sometimes they lay at an angle like that, but more often than not, there's just a circle. And if you could dig into the rock, you would see the rest of the nautiloid in there. But the nautiloid's coming out at you. You following me? So he's been cut so you don't notice it. He discovered that there are billions of nautiloids in the red wall limestone. A massive community of nautiloids, but it gets even better. There is a preferred orientation. There's some that are off squiggly, but almost all of them are facing the same direction. Now, what does that mean? It means they were all fossilized in the same current flow, not over hundreds of years or even days, but like literally one flow event aligned them all and buried them all in there, like a submarine landslide or something. So now you go to Grand Canyon and they say, oh yeah, there's billions of nautiloids. We know that now, because the creationists that studied it. Genesis 8 says, God remembered Noah and every living thing and the cattle that was with him in the ark, and God made a wind to pass over the earth. And the waters assuaged. The waters returned off the earth continually. After the end of the 150 days, the waters were abated. Old King James word just means that they flowed away. Now, here's the second most common question I get asked, and that is, where did all the water go? So the first question is, how did you get all the animals in the ark? The second one is, okay, so the earth is covered with water. Where did it go? What happened to this water? Yes? Give it a try. What do you think? Okay, think about it for a minute. Somebody else? Back where it came from, went down in the middle of the earth? Okay, evaporate up into space? Any other ideas? Do you remember? Evaporation. Okay, you're going with the evaporation? So it's about half a year. It shouldn't take a half a year for evaporation. I mean, it does evaporate some, but then it starts raining again and evaporates and rains, and you're establishing the more common hydraulic cycle like we see today. And maybe a little bit came down because of evaporation, but remember, it's raining during the flood, and so that really doesn't explain where all that water went. Interestingly enough, the answer is given in Scripture. It went into the deep ocean basins. That is, out here in the middle of the ocean, it gets really deep. There's enough water there now that if you took a big bulldozer and bulldozed all the dirt in the oceans, there would be 1.5 miles of water on top of the dirt. That's how much water is in these deep ocean basins. And if I, again, sucked all the water out, you can see how it goes in gradual, then drops off into these abysmal plains. So what happened is all this fairly new ocean, because the land is getting split apart, this is new ocean that's kind of getting revealed here, was very hot, lots of lava, but eventually it cools and it drops down. And the water runs off the continents down into these deep ocean basins. Say, Dino, Dave, you sound pretty sure of that. Well, if you look right there, you can see the drop-off. See, that was the original coastline right there. The drop-off. And in fact, Psalm 104 confirms this. It says, at thy rebuke they fled. The voice of thy thunder they hasted away. They go up by the mountains, they go down by the valleys. The ESV says the mountains rose up, the valleys sank down. That's where the water went. You go look at it sometime. That psalm is talking about the flood. That's the whole subject of the psalm. So it's in these deep ocean basins. Now, this is going to do some interesting things too. The uplift of the mountains, as the pressure of the water comes off, and the erosion of these freshly laid sediments is going to erode away a lot of canyons. You have freezing at the poles, and we start to get glaciers forming. And then in Genesis 8:15, the waters decrease continually until the 10th month. The 10th month and the first day of the month, this is a slow thing. It's gradual. Finally, the tops of the mountains are seen. And of course, eventually it gets dry enough that God tells Noah, go out, puts a rainbow in the sky, and promises never to flood the earth again. So that is the flood. Now, after the flood, you have an ice age that lasts for about 700 years, and that stores a lot of water up for a while, and you have these, you see upper left here, you have these land bridges, which lets you get from continent to continent and allows the creatures then to disperse across the earth. So you could walk from places like this continent to those islands. Today it's flooded, but you could walk like maybe from Florida to Cuba and that type of thing. Okay, we got one more point, but just before we hit point number 3, let's all stand up. Everybody stand up, stretch. We just had a great meal. Thank you, ladies. Oh, it's hard to stay awake talking about science stuff. Get a big breath of air. Stretch, okay, very good. Everybody sit back down again. We're going to be done in just a few minutes, but I want to give you some scientific evidence for catastrophe. If you're taking notes, this would be a really good place to take some notes. Because somebody's going to come along at some point in your life and say, you think all those rock layers happened like in a year? Are you kidding me? You think the Grand Canyon happened in a year? Are you kidding me? Don't you know that these layers form gradually over millions of years? Everybody knows that. So I'm going to give you some evidence right now for geological catastrophe. Okay, point number one, rapid formation. Point number one, polystrate fossils. Polystrate fossils. What's a polystrate fossil? Who knows? Yeah.
It's a fossil that covers several strata of rock.
Exactly. So it's poly, many, strata. It will go through multiple layers. For example, here's a tree that goes through multiple different rock layers. Here's an even better one. You see this same tree is coalified on the bottom, and it's permineralized or fossilized on the top. This is from Tennessee. They got lots of these there. Question, how can that tree stand for millions of years, because we know it took millions of years for these rock layers to form, right, without rotting? This does not make any sense. There's no way. It had to happen layer, quickly before the tree rots, and you have these different layers forming quickly, okay? Here is a creature. This is a little nautiloid fella here, and trilobites. I'm sorry, it's a trilobite. I said nautiloid. It's a trilobite. And we see him going through multiple layers. So you have the bottom rock layer, and the middle one, and the top one. And this is a bad day for this little trilobite fella. He is waking up, he stretches, he goes out for a little walk, and along comes a big wave and puts a bunch of mud on him. He's like, it's going to be a bad day. He digs out from underneath, and he starts walking along a little bit. Another wave comes in, plop, puts a bunch more mud on him. He says, I knew it was going to be a bad day. He about kills himself, finally digs out, he's just walking, and then plop, another wave comes, and it does kill him, and it's a bad day for the trilobite. And here's the fossil. We see his trail going back down through multiple layers, and in the top layer is the dead trilobite fossilized. Now, are you meaning to tell me that this little journey that this trilobite happened was over millions of years of going up through solid rock? No way. Slow and gradual does not work. These layers are coming in quick. Wave after wave after wave, catastrophe, polystrate fossils. Number two, surface features, raindrops and ripples. Who's got a pet? Somebody tell me if you got a pet. You got a pet? What's your pet's name? Henry. What is Henry, a dog or a cat? It's a cat. Henry's a cat. Let's say that there's a rainstorm and some mud out there, and the rain lets up, and Henry goes out for a walk, and he leaves some tracks. Are those tracks in the mud going to last for like weeks and months and years out there? No. What's going to happen to them? They'll get washed away. Maybe it'll be dry for a while and then kind of crumble and turn to sand, or maybe somebody will step on it, right? And yet we have lots of fossilized tracks. How did these tracks get preserved? The only way to preserve them is if another layer comes in and protects them and compresses them down and solidifies them and turns them into stone. Otherwise, it's just not going to last. And even if they're stone, they're going to like erode away unless layers are protecting them. And so we have ripples, ripple marks, very delicate things that shouldn't last very long, fossilized, and tracks of creatures all over the place in the fossil record. So polystrate fossils. Number two, surface features. Number three, conforming layers. Now, I'm going to give you a little geology here. Don't be scared. Don't be scared. You guys are a smart crowd. You're going to get this. You guys are all going to get this, okay? Conforming layers. Conforming just means if it's all flat, or if it's flat, it's all flat. If it's bent, it's all bent. Here's some conforming layers in Argentina. My friends, I was driving Highway 47 coming in from St. Louis, and I'm coming by, right on Highway 47, right about the exit for Moscow Mills. You know what I'm talking about there? You look on the left, there's some beautiful layers right there where they had to blast to put the road through. I mean, you kids, when your dad's driving, just look at the rocks, you'll see things like this. You can do a little geology lesson right from the car. They're conforming layers. If one's flat, the other ones are flat. If one is bent, they're all bent. These, a whole mountain of layers, like a birthday cake all laid in there. Now, listen to me. If there's millions of years between the layers, are they all going to lay flat? Let's say you got a surface here and it's exposed for even 100 years. What's going to happen? Erosion, channels, brooks, trees are going to start digging down through and creatures are going to dig, gophers are going to dig, and you're not going to get a clean rock line like that. For you to get a clean rock line, it has to get another layer, has to happen fast before they have time to dig down in and soften it and erosion, or else it's just not going to be a clean line like boom, 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 boom. That's evidence of rapid formation. Does that make sense? Conforming layers. Without biosoils. Nothing's broken down. There's no sand. There's no dirt. It's just rock, 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 laying right flap dab on top of the next one. That's evidence of rapid formation. This one's so cool. Clastic dikes. So, sometimes we get these layers, and there's a little bubble or a little hole or something in a top layer, and because of the pressure of the above layers, some of the material from the bottom layers squirts up like toothpaste and bloop, fills the cavity. And then eventually sometimes you even get some erosion, and the top erodes off, but this bottom layer is a little bit harder, and you got these weird spikes sticking up because the bottom layer was harder and didn't erode. And we see this in different places of the earth where you got this spike, like what on earth is that? It's called a clastic dike, where the bottom layer squirted up. Now, what's that telling you about that bottom layer? It had to be soft. If it was millions of years older than the top layer, it would be rock-solid concrete. It might crack, but it's not going to squirt up. It was still soft when the next layers were coming in. Does that make sense? Here's another way to drive that same point home. Distinct layers bent together. Distinct layers bent together. So we have all these nice flat layers. Then maybe a little landslide happens or an earthquake or something kind of disrupts them and they all bend. Now, if they're all bending at the same time, what is that telling you? They all have to be soft. If this bottom one is millions of years old, is it going to bend like that? Snap, maybe, but you're not going to have things all bend like that. My friends, look at this whole mountain of bent layers. Do you see something like this happening on the earth today? Anywhere? No way. Catastrophe, flood. Look at this. There's a guy up there. Can you see that guy right there? Up there? By the fence post? I see this stuff. I say, hallelujah, I get charismatic, man. I love this stuff. Evidence of rapid formation. All these bent layers at the same time. I like what Ken Ham says. What's the fossil record? Basically, it's billions of dead things buried in rock layers, laid down by water all over the earth. The whole fossil record is this gigantic monument to the Genesis flood. That's what it is. All right, let's talk about ooparts. Ooparts are fun. These are so cool. What's an oopart? An out-of-place artifact. An out-of-place artifact. I've got one here. This, in my hot, sweaty little palm, is called the London artifact. This is a replica. The original's in safe deposit in Texas. In a layer that has dinosaur remains, a Cretaceous layer in the plateau along the Paluxy River there in Glen Rose, Texas, a man saw a rock and there was a piece of wood sticking out. So he took a chisel and chiseled it in half, and he noticed inside this rock was a hammer. Now remember, this is in the same layer that contains dinosaur bones. So of course, there was a Hammersaurus that was making hammers that we just don't know about, right? No, this is an out-of-place artifact. This isn't supposed to be there, according to the evolutionists. What's a hammer doing in the same rock layer as dinosaurs? This is a problem. I'll leave this here. You can take a look at it. 1944, a young man named Newton Anderson lives in West Virginia. His job as a young man, 12 years old, is to keep the coal furnace banked. So he goes down at night, and he gets a big old chunk of coal, put it in the coal furnace for the night, gets the biggest one, so he doesn't have to come down again until morning. He's opening the coal furnace, the shovel kind of bobbles, the piece of coal falls to the floor and breaks in half, and he sees something sticking out of the coal. He says, oh, that's kind of weird. Puts that aside, so I'll check that out in the morning, puts the rest of the coal on, and goes to bed for the night. Next morning he gets up, he begins to whack at it with a croquet mallet, and he extracts a bell from the lump of coal. Now, unfortunately, he was very efficient as a young man, and he took a wire brush and he scraped all the coal off the bell. Would have probably been good if he left it in the coal a little bit. But he's a 12-year-old kid, so you got to give him a little bit of grace. And here is a bell with a little demon-like figure on it. And this bell is a bronze bell with an iron clapper. The clapper is a little thing inside that goes ding, 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 right? And lo and behold, this matches up pretty good, because Genesis 4:22 says Tubal-Cain was an instructor, artificer in brass and iron. That's the two metals that work in the pre-flood world. So whoever built this bell missed the boat, an out-of-place artifact. We have human footprints in old layers, Permian limestone, supposed to be millions of years before man evolved. But there's a footprint somehow in there, in New Mexico. It's in there so hard they tried to cut it out, they couldn't cut it out. So there's no way this thing is carved. It's still there in the mountainside. So evolutionists will ask me, okay, Dino Dave, you've got some evidence for catastrophe, but let us ask you a question. Why are the fossils sorted into layers? Now understand, there's never quite as clean as the textbooks, but there's a general trend of sea critters, shellfish on the bottom, and then you might have some fish, and then we have things like dinosaurs and crocodilians, and then the mammals, and up top we have the birds. That's kind of a general trend of the fossil record. And they'll say, well, this evolved to this, evolved to this, evolved to this, evolved to that. How would we answer that as creationists? I'm sorry, what? That was the order they drowned. Remember what we talked about in the beginning? What's the first thing that's going to be buried in a flood? Sea critters. And then the water comes up and covers swamp critters. And what's the last creature that's going to die in a flood? Birds. This absolutely makes sense in a flood, right? And so some of this is habitat, some of it's intelligence, some of it's mobility, some of it's just body density. But that is the order that they are going to get buried in a flood. Absolutely. Absolutely. Here's Emmy Clark, University of Illinois, Urbane. He built this flume apparatus, and he put some fine dust in there, some sand, some coarser gravels, and some different fossils. He stirred them all up, and what happens is as the water begins to slow, the big things drop out, and then the lighter things, and then finally the dust takes days, but it finally settles out. It just naturally forms layers with the bigger fossils on the bottom. Every time. Rock layers is a relic of moving water. And flume experiments have proved this. So here's another question I got years ago. People threw this one at me. Well, Dino Dave, have you been to Yellowstone? There are 27 layers here on this one mountain in Yellowstone with forests in each one of the layers. So Dino Dave, are you meaning to tell me in the middle of the flood, a forest grew and that got buried, and another forest grew and that got buried, and another forest grew and that got buried, 27 of them, all within 1 year of the flood? And I have to confess, I didn't have an answer for the guy as to how all these forests could grow and get buried. But I said, look, we got lots of evidence the flood happened. Let us work on it. Maybe we'll get an answer for you next time. I mean, that's a valid answer, right? There's going to be some things we're working on all the time. Put that in the back of your brain. We're going to come back and answer it in a few minutes. Let's talk about Grand Canyon. Grand Canyon is the greatest geological icon on planet Earth. Any of you guys been to Grand Canyon? Oh, isn't it awesome? You come up to the edge. I came up to the edge with my whole family. We were there at a sunrise, kind of like this, and we come to the edge, and I'm like, ah! I started saying, oh, Lord, my God. My kids are like, Dad, 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 come on, come on. I'm just thrilled. I mean, it's awesome. The Grand Canyon. But the Grand Canyon is a problem for the evolutionists. Why is that? The water enters the Grand Canyon at 2,800-foot elevation, up here at the top. I think it's Lake Powell. Okay, the ground slopes up to 8,000-foot elevation. The Kaibab Plateau is a mountain, really. To see the Grand Canyon, you go up, 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 up the access road, and then you look down into the Grand Canyon from a mountaintop. Now, if this Colorado River eroded out the Grand Canyon over millions of years, how did it go over a mountain to erode it away? Rivers don't do that. They pull up and go around. They don't go climbing up over mountains. And the evolutionists have tangled themselves into all kind of knots to try to explain how the Colorado River did that. I can give you some of the theories later if you want to know, and the problems with every one of them. I have a different idea. I think the Grand Canyon happened very quickly as the floodwaters were running off the earth. And they're just kind of gouging out canyons because a lot of these layers are still soft, and it happens in days, not over millions of years. Now you say that to people and they look at you like you're crazy. The Grand Canyon formed in days? How did it take millions of years? No, it doesn't. We talked this morning a little bit about Mount St. Helens. Here's beautiful Mount St. Helens in 1980, pristine, gorgeous mountain with wonderful, beautiful little spirit lake kind of nestled into the bottom there. But something was stirring in Mount St. Helens. And on May 17th, 1890, the mountain had a temper tantrum. It blew its top. And a whole bunch of the mountain slid down the slope there into Spirit Lake, and this massive cloud of debris and ash and chemical came spewing out, the power of which just knocked trees out and literally blasted stuff for miles and formed this pumice plain, this massive ash plain, and a whole bunch of the mountains slid down. It blocked the Toutle River that comes out of Spirit Lake, and over the next weeks, the water went up in the lake, and finally it breached the top of the dam, and so you have all this mud and all this ash, and there you see the lake up there, and poosh, it really quickly forms a canyon. Why? Because it's all still soft. It's 1,000 feet wide, it's 140 feet deep, it's a 1/25th scale model of the Grand Canyon right there. You see this lady standing, you can see these layers. We know what these layers are. It's the original earth slide, and then it's the ash cloud, and then it's a second eruption. We know what all those layers are because we were there and we would see it. But you might think, oh, this took millions of years to form, and this canyon took millions. No. It happens fast in a catastrophe with moving water. And Mount St. Helens is this wonderful laboratory for creationists. But the story gets a little more interesting. All these trees got blown into Spirit Lake, and for years they were floating around the lake. You see the mountain still smoking in the background there. They're floating through the lake, these massive log jams of millions of trees floating around Spirit Lake. And here you see that they begin to get heavy over time, and the root balls are heavier than the logs, so they kind of start to float upright. And eventually the whole thing gets waterlogged, and they kind of drop down to the bottom. Well, here's Steve Austin and his buddy, a couple of crazy creationists. Creationists do things like this. And they're going to go in and they're going to scuba dive around to see what's going on down there. And there they are in the logs, and they're starting to shook at the bottom. And sure enough, these logs are planting on the bottom. So some logs plant, and more dust and debris settles. And then some other logs plant at a higher level, and then eventually more debris settles, and some other logs. Oh! And now we know what happened at Specimen Ridge in Yellowstone. So the creationists went back to Yellowstone. They took the tree rings, they did boreholes on the top and bottom. They all match up. They all grew at the same time. They just fell out at different levels. See, my friend, there will always be some questions. There will always be things that we don't have the answers to, but God has given us lots and lots and lots of evidence. But at the end of the day, you still have to come to Him by faith. I cannot argue you into heaven. I can't convince you against your will that you need to believe in God by giving you so much evidence. As a general rule, evidence is not the problem. The heart's the problem. We don't want to bow our knee to God. We want to be God, don't we? I want to be in control of my destiny. I don't want God to tell me what to do, what's right and what's wrong, and I don't want to give an account to Him, that's for sure. And that's why Hebrews says, without faith, it's impossible to please Him, for he that comes to God must believe that He is, and He's a rewarder of them that diligently seek Him. I want to end with a little bit of a challenge. Jesus was talking about the flood, and here's what Jesus said about the flood in Noah's day. As the days of Noah were, so shall the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days that were before the flood, they were eating and drinking and marrying and giving in marriage until the day Noah entered the ark, and knew not till the flood came and took them away. So shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. Jesus says, it's going to be just, at the end of the world, it's going to be just like it was in the days of Noah. And yeah, they were sinful and they were violent, but they also were just consumed with the things of this world. Is there anything wrong about marrying and giving in marriage and eating and drinking. No, these are the basic things of life. But that had consumed them to the point where they forgot about God and the spiritual. They were all about stuff down here. You know anybody like that? Oh, Dino, Dave, I tried to invite my neighbor to come out to the creation investigation. They just weren't interested because they're busy. They got this and that, and they're taking the kids to that, and they got the soccer, and they're going over here, and they got that, and they're enrolled in that, and his hunting, and he's got this hobby, and that. Stuff that maybe isn't bad, but they've forgotten about God. Don't have time for God. And Jesus said it's going to be the same way in the end times. And we read this in Genesis chapter 7, kind of an interesting comment that just kind of passes a lot of people by. But it came time for the flood, and God tells Noah to get in, and Noah and his children and their wives, his wife, they all get in there, 8 of them, they're in there. And you'd think Noah would just kind of had a mechanism, he'd close the door behind him, but no. God says, let me do that, step back, and God shuts him in. And he closes it, but good. Why does God have to close the door? What's with that? You might say, well, it's a good watertight seal. I have a different idea. Here's what I think happened. Once those rain waters started coming down, people started running up the hill for the ark, and they're going, Noah, we believe you now. We know you told us there's lots of room. We want in. Come on, just open the door one minute. My friends, these are his cousins, his nieces and nephews, his neighbors. Maybe some of them worked for Noah, helped build that ark, and they wouldn't believe. And there came a time where God said, that's it. You had your chance. It's all over. And Noah might have had a big heart, and he might have said, oh, man, wife, Shem, come on, let's open it. Come on, get a few of them in here. No. God said it's all over. It's all done. Now watch this carefully here. Jesus, when once the master of the house has risen up and has shut to the door, and you begin to stand without, to knock at the door, saying, Lord, open to us. And he shall answer and say unto you, I know you not whence you are. You see, my friends, there's going to come a time again where God is going to close the door on a whole generation. Right now, the door's open. The door being Jesus Christ. The way is open. There's going to come a time where that door is going to close. There will be a day of judgment. And these on the outside might be somebody sitting in this room. These on the outside might be your relatives, your friends, your neighbors. Do we have a burden to talk to them before it's too late? Oh, they're not listening. Well, they didn't listen to Noah, but he did his job. See, our job is to tell. The rest of it's with God. Are you doing your part? Are you telling them? Well, I'm kind of scared. I'm kind of embarrassed. What? They're going to die. And you're embarrassed to even tell them? See how messed up that is? God's going to shut the door on a whole other generation. My friends, we need to be active. We need to be out there. We need to be doing our part. Let's close in a word of prayer. Turn it back over to Pastor. God in heaven, thank you that this is more than just an interesting story. Thank you that you've given us abundant evidence for the flood and a